Good morning. Can you all hear me? Let me see. Can you hear me? Am I heard? Hello.
We hear you, Professor.
Oh, thank you very much. All two of you. How you doing? Hold on one second. I gotta close this door over here. I'll be right back. All right. I am back. Good morning. It is sunny, which is a plus. Does anybody like cloudy weather? Don't all speak up at once. Is there two of you? this is this is going to be the most bizarre class I've ever taught. Okay.
I will say I'm a fan of cloudy,
What's
rainy
that?
weather.
What's that? You
I
you
am.
you're a fan. You like rainy weather?
Yeah.
I
So
sometimes like it, but
for me, I just like being in Brooklyn when it's rainy. I like the city when it rains.
yeah, I get that. It's living in the city is sometimes an interior experience anyway. So when it rains, you kind of, you know, the energy inside is pretty cool. I live outside the city, so and it's with a lot of woods. So I do like the rainy weather actually, but I just for like 10 days in a row it freaks me out. So which is why early in my career I moved to Los Angeles for 7 years.
10 days in a
So
row of rain. Got to start wondering if you need to build an ark, huh?
yeah, right. Well, out there, yeah, crazy out in Los Angeles. But yeah, no, actually, I got over the course of my life, I guess mostly when I was younger, I lived in a lot of places that flooded a lot. I guess because they were cheaper. And so one place I was the super for a building. I wasn't really the super. I was just like a guy that lived there that got reduced rent because I helped out. I don't know anything about about taking care of places, but I was the super, and the basement always flooded, and so every time it would rain, I would have to like mop out the basement and clear the drains, and I now do not want to live anywhere where that floods. Like I want to be as high up as possible above and not in any streams, which happened in Brooklyn. I lived in a
I will
place
say
that
this is
literally,
someone who moved out of Brooklyn last November up to basically into the mountains, about 4 hours out of town. There is a lot. While you do not have to deal with a lot of rain, we deal with a lot more snow.
yes. Yes. And then when it melts, it gets insane. Here's everybody. Hello everybody. Here comes everybody. Um yeah, it was a snow melt can be like a huge problem when and then I don't really mind snow. I like snow, but I prefer it like a lot of snow or no snow. I don't like the in between where there's like kind of like a little bit of snow.
If it tells you anything about how seriously people take the snow up here, the snow plows go through about every couple hours to clear
Yeah,
the roads.
I know. You become a kind of an expert in it, and then you see people and like every single driveway has like a snowplow in it.
Hello.
Um, good good day. Hello, Chaz. How are you? Good morning.
I'm
I saw.
good.
I'm good. I'm good. This is my first class. Hello, Galaxy Note 8, which I'm assuming is not your real name, although it's a cool name. Who is that? Galaxy Note. Oh,
Hey,
hey.
Professor, this is Evan.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you say that one more time?
This is this is Evan Dowden. This is
Gotcha.
my
Okay.
first class.
Well, welcome to the
I need
class.
to adjust the name.
Yes, yes.
Thank you
No,
very
well,
much.
welcome to the class. That always happens in the beginning. Do you want to tell the class a little bit about yourself? Just a little bit about what you're doing at City Tech? And we'll do that for Trinity too, because I think Trinity's new also. Anything
All
you
right,
want.
I'm an
Give us a little
international
story.
student.
Okay.
I'm an international student from Grenada. I'm studying tourism and hospitality right now.
Oh, all right.
Um, I'm interested in history. I did a few history lessons before from in the Caribbean, and now
Oh,
I'm doing American history. So,
I took a I
yeah,
took a
that's pretty
Caribbean
much yeah.
I took a Caribbean history course in college, and it was one of the best courses I ever took. It was fascinating. So, Grenada, you
Yeah,
said
it is.
you're from Grenada.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
another place on my list of places that I would love to visit. So,
yeah. A
hello,
very
Harry.
small island.
Yes, yes, with a lot of
Uh-huh.
U.S. history in the 1980s as well in relation.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It had a U.S. Revolution down there.
yeah, yes, yes, during the Reagan administration, I think it was
Yeah, you're
1982.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're
So,
right. Yep.
yeah, maybe I'll work that in. I usually don't mention. There's so much to mention in this class, but I'll try to work something like that in for you. Okay.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, welcome to the class. Welcome to the class. I see Trinity is a new name too. Trinity, hello, are you there? Can you speak?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm a freshman. I
Okay.
study business and technology of fashion.
Excellent. And what other history courses have you taken? What do you so why'd you take
Um,
this course?
for the fall semester, I didn't take like a history course. Well, I guess it was history of art, the introduction.
Oh, yeah, that's history.
So like
Sure.
I just learned about architecture and paintings around like from like ancient Rome and like ancient Egypt.
Oh, that's super cool. That's great. Ancient art. I took a course in college in what was it? It was I can't remember. It was art from basically like 1880 to 1920. So you got to do like Van Gogh, and all the
Yeah,
impressionist painters and stuff. So that was a really cool course. But that was I didn't I'd never taken an ancient art course. That sounds like a very cool course to take.
yeah.
So, well, welcome to the class, Trinity. Welcome, welcome. You'll now just for those who are new, and I'll sort of everybody else has been here, right? Everybody else was here last week, right? Harry, Jeremiah, Devin, Chaz, Quentin, right?
Yeah.
Right. No, no, okay, good. Just checking. I was pretty sure. I was trying to do it in my mind. Awesome. So everybody else has already introduced themselves. I won't make you do it all over again. But uh, yeah. Hold on one second. Sorry, just one second. While I collect myself here. For Trinity and Evan, just remember that last week was just to give you a little bit of just to review for everybody. Really, last week was really not even part of the course. Last week, what we did was I did an introductory lecture, basically about U.S. history from 200,000 BCE to 1865, essentially, which is obviously a joke. I mean, you can't do that, but it kind of brought us up to where we're starting in the course. So that is posted. A link to that is posted. Let me start to share my screen here so that you can see what I'm looking at. Um, One second. I'm just taking. I usually don't take attendance, but with only 13 people in this class, I can do that. Let's see. Harry, Trinity, let's see, Quentin. Okay, good. Okay, so we see who else is not here. I'm gonna X that out. Leave site. Sorry, just give me one. Let me collect myself for a second here. Okay, share screen. What you are seeing is okay. So now you can see my screen. Um, Sorry, it's sometimes difficult with, I have a tiny Mac and sometimes it's difficult to get all these windows right. So what you're looking at here, by the way, is just my Zoom sort of scheduling thing that gives you an idea of, so you don't really have to look at this actually. But the reason why I kind of opened to that was, No, no. Here we go. Yeah, so here's our Blackboard shell. So for those, just to review for everybody, um, this is where we're going to be, where we're interacting with the course. The course really kind of begins to a certain extent today. Um, so you have here, remember, we're going to go folder by folder. I have here, so this is what we're doing today, which is really week 2, which has in it, the quiz. Um, Chaz, you had said you had had a little bit of trouble accessing the quiz. Did you figure that out with the quiz, or?
Yeah, I figured it out. For some reason, my MacBook had a block popper on the web app.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sometimes you get those pop-up blockers can be irritating. Yeah, so everybody should be able to take the first quiz. Let me go to the syllabus just to sort of show everybody where we're at, because it people can forget, and just to bring everybody up to. Here's our syllabus also. So again, if you're new, definitely take a look at this. If you're new, also take a look at right here. What I'm going to be doing every week is, after we have this session, I will be posting um, here a recording link. Once it gets generated, it takes a couple hours, and then I put it here. So if you were to look at this, it would immediately go to, see, it'll show you a version of this, which I'm not going to play right now, but that just gives you that idea. The Another thing that's changed since last week, just so everybody knows, is I've extended my office hours. I only had office hours Monday, Thursday from 11:30 to 12:30. I forgot I teach 3 classes this semester, even though this one's almost like a third of a class because of the number of people in it. I will be having office hours Monday from 10:30 to 12:30, and then Thursday from 11:30 to 12:30. There's a Zoom link here. I do kind of really strongly advise you to contact me ahead of time if you're going to come into office hours. Not that I'm not going to be there. It's just that, I'm not just sitting here like this. So I might have it open, I might not. But just sort of shoot me an email, and I'll open it up right away in case it's not open already, in case I'm not already online. So that's our Zoom link. That's a separate Zoom link than this Zoom link, by the way. As you see, I'll be reminding you every week, probably a couple days ahead of time. Hey, we're having a meeting on Wednesday, blah, blah, blah. Here's the link. And then I'll usually remind you like a couple minutes before class. So you got to show up to class. Everybody knows that. You're always able to watch the recordings, certainly if you miss, but you got to show up to, to fulfill the requirements of the class. Also, if you miss like basically if you miss like 2 classes or more, like live ones, there's like a 10% of your grade, which is whatchamacallit, like in-class activities, which kind of refers to just attending, and also any in-class activities that we do. You can't get that if you miss more than 2 classes. So immediately you lose 10% of your grade. So just so you know, you got to keep showing up to these. That's kind of how the course works. Let's see, what else are we doing? So if you look ahead, and this is always useful to do, next week is, so this week we're going to be talking about Reconstruction. We're going to be going through the history of Reconstruction. Remember, anytime that I'm talking and showing you slides and explaining history and things like that, you're always able to ask questions. So don't be afraid to jump in at any time. Raise your hand, or just start talking is fine too. Remember, for each of these weeks, you should have read whatever it says here to read. This is also mirrored on the syllabus. Especially important is reading the chapters in the textbook. The chapters in the textbook, again, the textbook's totally free, as I said, so you can just click on these links and it takes you straight to the chapter. Totally free, totally online textbook. Next week, this week, we're gonna look at Reconstruction. Next week, we're gonna look at the Gilded Age in the American West, which is kind of looking at the growth of cities as well as the expansion of the United States as a country, into Sioux lands, meaning Native American Sioux people in the Great Plains, as well as the sort of movement across the entire continent. And that's going to set us up for week 4, which is February 21st. February 21st is when your first assignment is going to be due. So I want to explain your first assignment. Of course, you have quizzes, remember, but I want to explain the assignment because it's because that's something that you know should start conceiving of and start working on now. So I'll explain the assignment that's due in 2 weeks, and I always like to explain assignments about 2 weeks before they're due. If we go further, just to give you an idea, there's another assignment that will be due March 13th. Notice we do not have class on February 28th. That's because the college does not. We don't, Wednesday classes don't meet on February 28th, so we don't meet. There's another assignment due on the 13th of March, which I'll explain later. And then you're gonna have a midterm exam. This exam is March 28th or thereabouts. I'll explain more about the midterm exam. Remember, the midterm exam, all the quizzes that you're taking, some of those multiple choice are gonna be on the midterm exam. So it behooves you to sort of take the quizzes. You're also able to take the quizzes as many times as you want to get a perfect score. So you're going to see some of those questions are going to be on the midterm. That makes it easy. It also incentivizes you to do the quizzes. And then also there'll be a sort of a take-home essay version of the midterm exam. The midterm exam we don't meet because I'm not administering that live. In fact, you have like a 2 to 3 day window to do that. But we don't meet that week because that's the week that you're taking the midterm. So we don't meet like this right here. Then April 3rd, April 10th is another assignment due, which is your final project proposal, which is something we'll probably start talking about next week. And then let's see, assignment 4, that's another assignment that's due May 1st. And then finally, your final project is due on the 15th, which is our last day. Okay. So and we'll talk more about all of those other components as we get to them. What I do want to do now, though, is talk about your first assignment so that you start thinking about it. It's not a super complicated assignment. You might have already looked at it. It's already been open. I'm going to remember all the assignments kind of live in the module that they're assigned to, right? So this assignment is due on the 21st, so it lives in the 21st, the module that corresponds to that. These are all, this is like a link directly to the chapters you're supposed to read, things like that. So this is called, I call this an old newspaper dive. I've conducted this assignment, you know, a lot because I like it. And I also like old newspapers. You know, call me crazy, but you know, the newspaper is almost dead as a medium, sadly. But old newspapers tell us a lot about the past, and they're almost never looked at. People just don't look at old newspapers generally. And one cool thing, and here's the instructions for it. One cool thing about it is that as newspapers are finite and they get destroyed, they crumble into dust, as we all know. If you ever handled an old newspaper, like a really old one. And about 25 years ago, kind of like around the dawn of the internet, the Library of Congress and other people saw an opportunity to really save a lot of this super fragile material from being destroyed. And what they did was they started to digitize it. They started to take pictures of it and scan it, high quality scans. They also started to do, you know, optical character recognition to kind of get all of the data out of many of these newspapers. And there's a site on the Library of Congress site, which is called Chronicling America, which is linked here. And so here's the link to it, which has like an enormous storehouse of old newspapers stretching from 1756 to 1963. See, all digitized newspapers, right? So, and see, you have all the pictures of them. So you can look up, and there's hundreds upon hundreds of different newspapers here, thousands and thousands of particular issues of each of these newspaper issues. What I'd like you to do for this assignment, again, it's due in 2 weeks, so you don't have to stress about it now, is I want you to find, and the instructions here kind of describe it, but it's just 500 to 1,000 words. It's not very long. That's about 2 pages. What I'm asking you to do here, no problem, Dinesh, no problem. What I'm asking you to do here is take any 3 issues of any single newspaper or multiple newspapers that are concerned with a particular event in US history as defined here, which is I'd like you to take an event in US history that is kind of before World War I. What event that is really up to you. I give here in this, I give I give here an example of the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was a terrible event, which we'll be discussing next week, in which the U.S. Army killed over 300 elderly men, women, and children um, in in a sort of basically in a Native American massacre of the Sioux, who were practicing this sort of ceremonial dance that white settlers in the West perceived to be threatening, basically. And so I choose that example, and I won't get into the history of that. We'll talk about that next week. You should read about that for next week. But so if you were to choose that, what you would do is you go to Chronicling America, you figure out what the date is, right, which was 1890. So you can narrow down your date here to whatever the date of the event is. You don't have to choose that event, by the way. You can choose whatever event you want. You can choose an event even from the Civil War, even though it's before this class, right? So choose an event, pick some sort of moment. And then find 3 newspaper issues, any 3 really, that talk about it. What I'd like you to do in your assignment is you don't have to make a thesis. This is not an essay. All I want you to do is look at each of those issues and compare how they treat the event differently. Now, they could be treating the event differently because the 3 newspapers you chose were from different parts of the country. They can treat the event differently because they are from 3 different moments in time, but they're from the same newspaper, right? They can treat the event differently because they have different political perspectives. They could, all 3 issues, all 3 articles you choose are going to treat the event differently in some way. And that's what I want you to tell me. You don't have to come up with a thesis. It doesn't have to be like a huge research project. I just want you to tell me what the differences are between the 3 articles. So, and that's one part of this is, like, say you were to choose, the Adams County News of Richfield, Washington. I have no idea. So let's say I'm going to choose the end of the Civil War. Okay, I don't even know if this paper was around then. So, but let's say I'm going to go 401 1865 to 04 31 1865. Oh, there's no 31 in April. So let's just see what happens. Or let's just not choose a particular newspaper. Let's choose, like, I want to look at a California newspaper that talks about the end of the Civil War. Okay. And then I search. Oh. Then I do another search, right? So that's California from, let's go back to 1865. I know there's a California newspaper in here from 1865. There's got to be. Let's see, 1865, let's put 1866. And then say, I don't know, let's just even like put in something vague like slavery and see what comes up with California. And there we go. Place or dealer, weekly union. See, all of these are from 1865 to 1866, and they all talk about slavery in some way. So say I'm just going to look at the Shasta Courier. And you'll see one of the struggles in doing the assignment is you got to deal with how these newspaper things, I know how to do it. It takes a little bit of a learning curve as to how to work these things, how to work, moving the paper around the thing. I highly recommend you do this on a computer. See, this is the late president. Our readers will find chronicled elsewhere the particulars of the death of President Lincoln by assassination. So look, April 29th, 1865. So you can do the Lincoln assassination and just take 3 articles and just look at how this article treats the Lincoln assassination, find another article from another paper or from the same paper from a different date, and then just compare and contrast them, essentially. And again, I don't need a thesis. I don't need like a huge, reinventing the wheel here. I just want you to look at the newspapers and write about what you found. Does anybody have any questions about that? Any questions about how that works? So I don't see any. All right, no questions. All right. So, is there any specific time frame on the news we choose? Yeah. So basically anything from basically the start of the Civil War. I think I say it in here somewhere. Where is this? I should. It's funny that I don't. I used to say this more explicitly. Anyway, good question. I'd rather you choose something from before World War One. So World War One ends, let's say U.S. entry into World War One is 1917. So something between 1861 and 1917. Okay. Um, Mainly because I don't want, choosing something all the way to 1963, it starts to get out of the realm of old newspapers. So I like really old newspapers. I kind of want you to struggle with the language in these old newspapers a little bit. That helps us by struggling with the language in old newspapers. It helps us kind of get our minds into the time frame. So, does that answer your question, Joel? Yeah, I'll just type it here just so everybody knows. 1861 to 1917. So thank you for asking that too. I thought that was on this. So whoops, sorry, I just typed that direct message. I did not mean to do that. 1861. So there's your time frame for it. So remember, 3 articles. Whatever your criteria are for choosing those articles, that's totally fine. Just make them about the same general event. And as you can see with the slavery example, you can find an event through just typing in a word, right? So if I put in slavery and then Abraham Lincoln's assassination comes up, then you just start doing that. Take note of the date, take note of the papers, things like that. Great, cool. All right. So that's for 2 weeks from today. But just start thinking about that. I'll mention that, of course. I'll mention that next week and remind you of it. But that's your first real assignment for the class, aside from the quizzes, which you're going to be doing throughout the course. All right. Let's see what else. Anybody have any questions about anything else before we start talking about Reconstruction? Anything else? I've already gone through half an hour here. Let's go to. So this is always an interesting lesson for me to teach in this class because this is the only, I teach both halves of the U.S. history survey. So all of history up until 1865, which is kind of what I summarized last week and is in that recording. And then I teach 1865 to the present, roughly. The time frames kind of differ depending upon what school you're in, but this is yes, this is U.S. history since 1865, and this is the only lesson that I teach in both sections, right? So it's the only it's the only lesson that appears in both the first half of the history survey and the second. And it's really the logic about Reconstruction is that where it is placed in the U.S. history survey it's because there's 2 things. One is it's the aftermath of the Civil War, right? And even though the first half of this course goes up to 1865, I still teach it because this really goes up to 1877. Reconstruction, just so you know, starts in 1865, goes to 1877. And I teach it in both halves, not only because it kind of is that linchpin between the 2 parts of the course, but also because it's the most important lesson in American history. You might say, wait, I thought the Civil War was the most important. I would contest that. I think that Reconstruction is the most important lesson. And it's also the most important lesson for us today, because the country that you live in is a country that was created out of this really kind of messy bandage that happened after the Civil War tore the country apart and turned it into 2 countries. So where you are sitting right now, unless you're in another country, but I imagine you're sitting here, probably in New York City, this country is the product of this Reconstruction. And just like a pot that you break, like a flower pot or a glass, putting that back together is perfectly is impossible. And that's a good thing, because the country that existed before Reconstruction was not a country in which the majority of the people in that country had really any rights whatsoever. and that is not restricted, by the way, to those who were enslaved. That means every single woman in the United States prior to 1865 also had virtually no civil rights. And so Reconstruction is really where the United States comes together. And again, but the bandage that's put on it is a series of fixes in the US Constitution, and hopefully dreamed of fixes in US society that will solve what caused the war in the first place. That was the idea. How Reconstruction came about is terribly messy. It was not a unified process. Not everybody agreed on it. Nobody agrees on it today. It is still the basis for much division in this country, especially in regards to things like race relations, especially in things in regards to civil rights, especially in regards to things like the Supreme Court. When this is Frederick Douglass, you'll know, everybody's heard of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was probably the best orator of the 19th century, the best public speaker. Frederick Douglass was a person who escaped from slavery in Maryland, made his way up north to Massachusetts and New England, and met people that were abolitionists. He became an abolitionist himself. I mean, he was enslaved, so you would imagine he was an abolitionist just by default. But he came amongst all these abolitionists and really became a leader among them, many of whom before that were white. And his personal experience of being enslaved really informed how many abolitionists and Americans in the 1850s, prior to the Civil War, conceived of what slavery was. And Frederick Douglass then went on during the Civil War to obviously support the North, the Union in the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, he actually became the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a bureau that was designed, which we'll talk about, that was designed to help those who were formerly enslaved make the transition to citizenship. And it was designed to protect many of those who were formerly enslaved from the brutality and excesses of those in the South that wanted to maintain a situation of slavery. He then went on, and so this particular speech that he gives here, which I've asked you to read and is in actually and linked to, and I could actually link to it right here, the American Europe. He gives this in 1877, which is the end of Reconstruction. So the last year of Reconstruction, he gives this speech. And in this speech, he talks about what the war meant, and what the war meant to not only himself, but what the war meant to the United States in the refashioning of the country. And I'll just look at this quote here that that he says. He says, "But the sectional character of this war between the North and the South was merely accidental," he claimed. "Its least significant feature. It was a war of ideas, a battle of principles and ideas which united one section and divided the other. A war between the old and the new, slavery and freedom, barbarism and civilization, between a government based upon the broadest and grandest declaration of human rights the world ever heard or read, and another pretended government based upon an open, bold, and shocking denial of all rights, except the right of the strongest." So as you can see, Douglass is setting up two sides here, right? There's barbarism and civilization, slavery and freedom, the old and the new, that the new world that was being created by Reconstruction in 1877, which was failing in 1877, by the way. The project of Reconstruction was coming to an end, a terrible end. But in that moment of hope, in these 12 years that we're going to discuss today, there was the hope that a stronger union could be created that would last for all time. and be a light to other countries as well, would revive the American dream, which had really, in a sense, died for many people in the Civil War. And in his thesis here, he says the North, the Union, was the progenitor of the new civilization, freedom. And those who were not, those who lost, the Confederacy, Southern states, especially white Confederates in the South that sought to keep slavery, they were the past. Does anybody think that's true? Does anybody think that I mean, it sounds right. Does anybody? I mean, I'll just throw it out there, but does anybody think that Douglas was right, or what parts of him were perhaps did not come true? Anyone? I can always fill in the blanks. The problem with Douglas's thesis is that he can't see the future. And he can't see the fact that while his point of view is today the dominant point of view on the Civil War, the fact is, in 1877, when he's making this speech, he is abundantly aware that the Confederacy was coming back. And then not only was the Confederacy coming back, that a lot of the gains that others like him who had been formerly enslaved had gained in those 12 years were being eroded through a series of tricks, really. Tricks in playing with the constitutional amendments that were passed, tricks in playing with state law, tricks in playing with terrorism. And what we'll talk about today is this optimism and decline that occurs in Reconstruction, and which leaves us the legacy today, here today in 2024, of trying to bring to life the true hope of Reconstruction, which was not only improved or a solution to these this racial discord and this sectional discord, but also an agreed upon idea about what the United States is. Today, this country is more divided than at any point since the Civil War politically. And many people have seen this split in the same way that Douglas saw this split during Reconstruction. Now, that may or may not be true. But the fact that we're still thinking in that context has a lot to do with how important this part of the course is. So this is, for instance, this is a statue of Robert E. Lee, a traitor who fought against the Union in the Civil War. And he was the leader of the Confederate troops in the Civil War, the Confederate Army. This statue was on the campus of the University of Virginia until a few years ago when it was taken down. A few years ago, during the start of Donald Trump's administration in 2017, you might remember in Charlottesville, there was a march of white supremacists to prevent the removal of this statue, which was seen as, which then became really, the images of that became the rallying cry for Joe Biden's campaign in 2020, saying, look, this is evil. These, there are, as Donald Trump had said, there are no good people who are white supremacists who are marching here in Charlottesville to preserve this monument. So you see how pervasive, and this goes right back to the Civil War and goes right back to Reconstruction. This monument, by the way, was not put up right after the Civil War. This monument was not put up until the 20th century. So the memory of the Civil War and the memory of Reconstruction, even in Virginia, even in this college town, not a college town, one of the most, the most open-minded and successful universities in the country, still had a statue of Robert E. Lee all the way up until 2020, 2021, 2022. Here's another Confederate monument honoring the Confederate dead. I believe this is in it. This was, I don't know if this one's been removed, by the way. This is in Georgia. Here's another Confederate monument. This is the Jefferson Davis. He was the president of the Confederacy. This is in Arizona. Arizona wasn't even a state during the Civil War. So you see the pervasiveness of these memorials to Confederates who had fought against the country and lost. And just like what you saw Douglas say there in 1877, talking about the drama of this of the war and what it meant. Well, certainly Douglas's message was not resounding among those who built this monument to Jefferson Davis in Arizona, or the monument to Robert E. Lee. This is a timeline showing the construction of Confederate monuments throughout, throughout the country. This is, each dot represents, I believe, a different monument. Notice here, I know this is a little bit small, but if you notice here, you have, this is 1870. Notice there's a few monuments that are put up to the Confederates, right? And then look at this, 1900 to 1920, this huge explosion in monuments. That's because many of those who had served in the war were then dying. So a lot of those former Confederates were then passing away, and in order to memorialize them and memorialize the lost cause, as it comes to be called, the supposed cause of Confederates in fighting against the Union and fighting and seceding from the Union, this is when you have this whole giant series of monuments that's built. So that's when the Robert E. Lee statue on the University of Virginia campus went up, and most of those other monuments that you saw. There are thousands of them, many of them which are still in the process of being dismantled in this country. Notice how these monuments still kind of fritter along here. Then in the Civil Rights era, there's an entirely other moment where the South starts to build monuments to Confederates, right as the true promise of Reconstruction starts to become real for many during the Civil Rights movement. It'd take 100 years after the passing of many of these constitutional amendments to the realization of them. So it's just the same thing. So let's talk about the causes of the Civil War first before we start here. Sorry, get this. Did not know the angle of the sun here. I might have to close that. Let's look at some of the causes of the Civil War before we start. So the first three causes of the Civil War are slavery, slavery, and slavery. I remember taking American history back when I was in high school, which was a long time ago, and being told, yeah, it's slavery, but here's all these other causes too. And there were other causes, but each of them came back to slavery, right? You were always told, oh, well, there were economic differences between the North and the South. Those economic differences were because of slavery. You're always told, other reasons. The North wanted more power. It was a war of northern aggression or something. That's how many people were taught in the South up until even recently what the war was. Yeah, it was because of slavery. Okay. The differences between the two sides, and this is a electoral map from 1860 of Abraham Lincoln's win, shows you that split. It's right there. That's the split in the country, regionally. And it wasn't just regional. It didn't have to do with economics. It didn't have to just do with, it had to do with slavery. The Industrial Revolution of the 1820s, which brings us everything like locomotives to factories, all of that, in the 1820s and 1830s really accelerated this split between the North and the South. The South continued to be an agrarian agricultural place that was dependent on slavery, and the North increasingly not only banned slavery, but also increasingly was dependent on factories and dependent on immigrant labor, as well as labor in general. You started to have a different economic system arise with the Industrial Revolution, in which people worked for a wage. People didn't work on a farm. People worked by a time clock. Now, none of us really like doing that. But that difference between those two types of economic systems, one which was built on slavery and agrarian work, largely on the backs of those who had been abducted from Africa and their descendants. The North, on the other hand, was moving further and further away from that towards a technological and industrial future. So that was a big difference. So yeah, there's an economic difference, but again, the agrarian side doesn't work really without the exploitative nature of slavery. So because most of that slavery was based on cotton, which was one of the hugest crops in the United States all the way into the 1960s, cotton. And so cotton was really the engine of the South. The South was completely dependent on cotton. Cotton was totally dependent on slavery. The expansion west of the South and the North was where this balance between the two started to come apart. And it started to come apart because they started to compete for, and I described this last time, they started to compete for different areas. Like Missouri here was largely populated in the beginning by slaveholders from the South. They wanted slavery. Those Northerners who came in, did not want slavery. This became a huge problem in Kansas, where the Civil War really begins in the late 1850s, where settlers, pro-slavery settlers and anti-slavery settlers, both go to the same place, and then they start to kill each other. So the Civil War really kind of started there, like a low-grade war. And this westward expansion all the way to California, where the Compromise of 1850, which made California a state, but also made the fugitive slave law, that was that particular compromise also fueled the Civil War as well, because it started to break apart the country as the North did not want slave catchers coming up to North and kidnapping their citizens. You also had competing forms of nationalism. I mean, one thing that was about the North and the South was that they both had different ideas about what it meant to be patriotic and what it meant to be proud to be an American. And that's not only today. That goes all the way back to the era before the Civil War. And what I mean is the North thought of itself as, a growing industrial powerhouse in the world. They saw themselves as a growing sort of international presence in a sense. The South, on the other hand, had an idea of the country which you might call Jeffersonian, or you might say was very much tied to farming and was then also tied to slavery. So their form of their agrarian world was not possible without slavery. So they also folded slavery in before the Civil War as part of what they felt proud about, really. They felt proud more in the sense of how English monarchs would have felt proud. They actually, many slaveholders modeled themselves after English monarchs, thinking of like, those who were enslaved on a plantation as the serfs or peasants in a sense, who they provided for. They thought of it this way. Of course they didn't, and these people had no rights whatsoever, and they wanted to keep it that way. But that was their form of nationalism. So it's a very different form, a form that doesn't really in many sense exist anymore, but you have to understand those two different ideas. The other thing about this, which was interesting, another cause was the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence was a huge problem for the South. And the South, in fact, all the way up into the Civil War, kind of ignored it. Specifically ignored Thomas Jefferson, slaveholder. The biggest slaveholder among all U.S. presidents, by the way, was Thomas Jefferson. He owned more slaves than any other U.S. president. And if you want to hear more about Thomas Jefferson, I urge you to take the first half of this survey course. And Thomas Jefferson wrote presciently and prophetically and also revolutionarily in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Of course, what does he mean by men? Right? The South is denying that those who are enslaved are men. He's not talking about women, or at least he doesn't say women. But increasingly, as you get into the late 19th century, and even right before the Civil War, women are like, we're part of that men thing you're talking about. We're part of mankind. So just, we're part of it too. And that his all men are created equal was a sort of unfolding of liberty for more and more groups. That perception of what the Declaration of Independence meant was becoming very, very strong in the North. Because it meant that slavery had to be destroyed in order for this to come true, as well as the oppression of women. That's what many women who supported abolitionist efforts thought as well. So the Declaration of Independence starts to take on this magical power almost in the North, and in the South they kind of are like, yeah, well, whatever it said, who cares? They don't interpret it as very important. They don't see it as part of the Constitution, so they're like, whatever. And it's not part of the Constitution. But nevertheless, it is still used, by the way, by the Supreme Court to decide cases. The text of Declaration of Independence. In the South, let's take it from the South's perspective, what has happened during the Civil War, and where it finds itself at the point, at the time of Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865. First of all, many of their cities have been destroyed. Atlanta has been burned to the ground. Columbia, South Carolina has been burned to the ground. Richmond, Virginia, large portions of it have been burned to the ground. Many of their other cities were untouched, by the way. I mean, cities in Texas, New Orleans was relatively unscathed because it had been taken over very early by the Union. So, but there was, so you had you had scenes of ruins like this and scenes of privation. You had in the agricultural realm, the South could not grow during the last couple of years of the war much in the way of cotton, and they could not have these large cotton plantations, and so a lot of the money that they were making in exporting this cotton disappeared. They couldn't grow simple food because many of the soldiers who would have worked on the farm were going and fighting. And then many of those who were enslaved just left. They left the place that they had been enslaved and moved to cities for help and support from the Union Army. So agriculturally, the South was in tatters, and there was starvation in many areas. The economic effects were humongous. Property itself would come to, across the South, be redefined at the point of Northern guns. The North forced the South to essentially redefine the fact that, first of all, people could not be owned. Okay. Not only was property not sacrosanct, which is what the South believed. The South believed, in the John Locke ideal, everybody's entitled to life, liberty, and property. The North says, no, you're not entitled to property if that includes people. And so it might seem like a rather, unbelievable kind of situation, but the South really tied itself to the fact that they could buy and sell people. And redefining property that way meant redefining that property in their minds as human beings. And many never did that. Many who lived in the South never did that. And folded a lot of racist beliefs into that belief system. The South was really, after the Civil War, not only devastated, but was really kind of becoming an agrarian backwater in relation to European countries, which were industrializing very fast. It was becoming a place which had one crop, cotton, which is actually a terrible crop in many respects, but a hugely lucrative crop, and their entire society was based on one crop that was dependent on enslavement. So you cut out slavery, you got to find a way to grow that cotton because that's how the whole. But it's basically such a tenuous kind of economic system that it really falls apart after the Civil War. And what does the South do? South is not clear what it's going to do. Also overturned the established legal framework of society. Every single Southern law, many of which dealt with enslaved people or property in that respect. I mean, those who were enslaved had no legal rights. Okay, so there's no laws saying, first of all, the enslaved could not marry, enslaved could not own property, enslaved could not even appear before court, enslaved could be murdered by those who supposedly own them. So the entire framework of society, legal framework, has to be rewritten. And then last, and probably most importantly for us today, because a lot of these have been, I wouldn't say solved, uh, but the cities were rebuilt, the South diversified in terms of its economy. It's no longer an agrarian backwater. It still has some of the highest rates of sort of like child mortality and things like that in much of the Deep South. And then obviously all the laws were changed. But emotionally, the South many large portions of the South never got over the Civil War. And many Southerners felt that what had happened was this, and they, kind of in this kind of fantasy world, they believed that this great aristocratic culture which existed in the 1850s, which they also believed was benevolent towards those who were enslaved, had been violated by the North. The North had come in and destroyed their just and wonderful society. And that many believe that their life's work would be devoted to bringing that back. Not only exclusively, or even at all in some cases, in the form of bringing back actual enslavement, but in creating the same sort of situation of dominance of the Confederacy, which was based in white supremacy, bringing that back. That's what many Southerners wanted after the Civil War and well into the 20th century. And they said it, so we should just believe them when they say it. All the way up to the Civil Rights era, in which the country almost falls apart again, in which there's almost another revolution, by the way, during the Civil Rights era, which we'll get to, in which the country starts to wrestle with the fact that Reconstruction had really been somewhat of a half measure as of 1877. So we'll get into all of that. Here's a picture of Atlanta after being burned to the ground by Sherman's troops as he marched through in 1864. Here's some other images of these southern cities. This is Union soldiers tearing up railroad lines, railroad tracks. As Sherman's army marched through the South, they destroyed everything they could find. And I talked about this last week. This is here a copy of the printed copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued as a government document in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln issued this in September of 1862, and it was supposed to go into effect on January 1st, 1863, in which it did. And what the Emancipation Proclamation said was that all of those who were enslaved in states that were still fighting against the North, so that did not include, by the way, those who were enslaved in the North, of which there were still some. There were still slaves in New Jersey, for instance, or in Maryland, for instance. But those states such as Kentucky, which the Union had invaded and had control of as of 1862, which still had, or West Virginia, for that matter, those enslaved were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation said that anybody who was enslaved in a state that was fighting against the Union, they are forever free, it says. Now, this is radical, but it's not like a blanket banning of slavery, remember. And it's only a presidential proclamation. So the president says something. Remember, even in our society today, the president could say whatever they want. Trump said a lot of things. They didn't become law. And, Abraham Lincoln says this, makes a proclamation, a executive proclamation, which during a war, as commander-in-chief, has the force of law. But then when the war is over, what? And this was something that Lincoln worried a lot about. He worried a lot that this banning of slavery, which he said, which had no real practical effect, except for the fact that what it did was it legitimized the fact that as the Union Army went further and further into the South, any human being they found that had formerly been enslaved was now first contraband, meaning they were converted from being a person who was enslaved and property. They were converted into property that the Union Army took, and then the Union Army liberated that property. See, that was one of the things that the Emancipation Proclamation did. Emancipation, notice here this image, and I only show this image, which some people could certainly find offensive. This is a postcard issued in 1909 about the Lincoln Centennial and centennial of Lincoln's birth, in which Lincoln is seen as this great figure emancipating the slaves, right? Here's these enslaved formerly enslaved with the chains, sort of Lincoln, our great liberator. And that's a great story. And a lot of people still today in this country believe that version of history. And there's a lot of truth to it. Hey, Lincoln went out on a limb, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This Emancipation Proclamation could have gotten him not elected in 1864 and very nearly did, very nearly lost. So after the Civil War and Reconstruction, and after post-Reconstruction, there's still this idea that Lincoln is, the great emancipator. And here's another not to take anything away from the Emancipation Proclamation and not to take anything away from Lincoln, all of which are very important parts of this story. But Lincoln didn't really free all of those who were enslaved. Here, for instance, is an 1864 campaign poster. It's a McClellan campaign poster. McClellan was Lincoln's former general of the Army of the Potomac in the Civil War, who then turned against him, ran against him in 1864, tried to get him out of office in order to really bring back slavery and end the war. That's what McClellan wanted to do. Notice how it says here that elect Lincoln on the Republican ticket, you will bring on, excuse the language, Negro equality, more debt, harder times, another draft, universal anarchy, and ultimate ruin. And McClellan will bring peace and white supremacy. Notice, this term, the opposite of that is white supremacy, literally. And so that's what McClellan was running on, and that was the essential division. For this picture, this picture is a picture taken by Matthew Brady, one of the most famous photographers in U.S. history, who was the first to show dead bodies in war. And the dead, and those were Confederate dead that he took pictures of there, I believe. Who was fighting the Civil War? Well, just remember I was talking about Lincoln being the great emancipator and this kind of being somewhat of a fiction. The fact is, one of the greatest untold stories of the Civil War, which most people don't understand even today, is that the Civil War was the largest slave revolt in human history. That those who were enslaved were not recruited or freed by Lincoln at all. They freed themselves and went to the Union Army and said, "Give me a gun, and I will go and fight those who had formerly enslaved me." It was a slave revolt. And without that humongous, massive slave revolt of hundreds of thousands of people, men and women, who went over the lines and went to Union Army and demanded to be armed, without their efforts, there is no end to that Civil War. It was a slave revolt. And that's how it should be looked at. Not to take anything away from Lincoln. He did what he did. But Lincoln had famously said at the beginning of the war, if this war can end without one slave being free, I will do it. He eventually realized that that was not possible to do that, and became the great emancipator, which again, he was. But the real story of the war is those who were enslaved, many of them who were illiterate, many of them who were forbidden by law from being able to read. They are the heroes of the Civil War because they fought for their own freedom. They didn't have to be convinced of that. They didn't have to be convinced of that. And they were not liberated by the Northern Army. They liberated themselves and put so much pressure on the Northern Army that the Northern Army was forced to allow, African Americans to serve in the Army, which became the basis of the United States Colored Troops, which was what was called the USCT. One thing that Lincoln knew, and remember, as I just explained with the Emancipation Proclamation, he knew that what he was saying was just a proclamation. It's not law. It's inspirational, and it's a famous document, but it has no basis in law. And he knew that if the Civil War ended without, if the Civil War ended, the Emancipation Proclamation would have no effect, because it was just a presidential proclamation. If he left office, it would have no effect. You could have another president come in who's like, forget the proclamation. I proclaim something different. And so, and I urge everybody to go see this movie, Lincoln. which is one of the most probably one of the best depictions of Lincoln in cinema. But it's not about Lincoln's life, by the way. It's about the last days of Lincoln's life, or the last months of Lincoln's life, in which he throws his entire self into drafting the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which, as you see here, consists of 2 sections, and which passes Congress narrowly in 1865, narrowly. But he is so fervent about this being passed that he knows that if this is not done, slavery will just come back. And so here's the 13th Amendment. Neither Section 1, which is the relevant section, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Notice the clause, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, which again seems like a standard thing to put in. You know that if someone is incarcerated, they don't have rights to, for instance, not work in a particular prison. Prison labor is a major part of many countries' economies, including China and North Korea. The United States has one of the largest prison populations today in the world, and people work. So if you could have somebody who's in prison say, hey, you know, I'm being treated like I'm being enslaved here because I'm only getting like 5 cents an hour or something like that, you could see why that clause might have been necessary, or might have been perceived to have been necessary for those who are in prison, because that would give them the right to perhaps, you know, litigate their way out of prison. So there's a certain logic there. But this hole in the 13th Amendment, you could drive a truck through, and the South drives, I guess not a truck, but the South drives a giant, you know, wagon train through. The South sees this and they say, oh, okay, all we have to do is to bring slavery back is to incarcerate everybody we want to enslave. And that's where the 13th Amendment kind of fails. I mean, the 13th Amendment is obviously a hugely important amendment. And this was all that Lincoln could get through before he was assassinated a few months after its passage. But this is the beginning of 3 amendments that we're going to discuss today: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. The 14th probably, and I don't think there's a lot of argument about this, the most important amendment in the entire U.S. Constitution. Yes, even more important than freedom of speech. Yes, you know, because the 14th Amendment activates those first 12 amendments and 13th Amendment and makes them true for all people. So the 14th Amendment is going to be really important. But the 13th Amendment obviously is important as a way of setting down the line, like there will be no more slavery. This institution called slavery, in which the buying and selling of people is permitted, that system is dead. And so in that sense, it's good. But that codicil, except as a punishment for crime, wherever the party shall have been duly convicted, becomes a big, big, big problem during Reconstruction. I do this slide. This is more of a narrative slide. This is not really an analytical slide. So it's just to kind of tell a story. On April 3rd, Union troops enter Richmond, which has been looted by Union troops who have finally broken through Confederate lines and invaded. This was the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And Union troops enter it, burn down huge sections of the city, which Lincoln, by the way, told them not to do. But the army, you know, many people were angry. April 4th, this I just find absolutely one of the most remarkable things in U.S. history. On April 4th, Lincoln takes a train to the front lines and then is carried into Richmond. He's actually sort of taken by coach into Richmond, Virginia, and enters. This is a day after Union troops enter. So imagine this: a president is going to a defeated power It's just amazing to think about. I mean, imagine like, George W. Bush going to Baghdad in 2003 or four. Imagine, I mean, it's just Franklin Roosevelt going to, Berlin, which he never made it because he died. But going to Berlin in, in May of 1945. He goes to Jefferson Davis's house, who was the president of the Confederacy, right? Who's fled. And here's the White House of the Confederacy. One of the reasons why we don't have a term Southern White House, which Donald Trump has repeatedly called Mar-a-Lago, is because this was called the Southern White House. And so try to stay away from those terms. He goes into Jefferson Davis's house and sits down in Jefferson Davis's chair. And there's a reporter with him. And Lincoln looks out the window in the back in the gardens of Jefferson Davis's house, the White House of the Confederacy, and looks out over the lawn, and he's just lost in thought. And the newspaper person sitting there writes, and this is published the next day, writes, what was he thinking? What could be going through this man's mind? 650,000 people were dead. The country had been torn apart. He had waged a war for 4 years and been present for that war, been the leader for that war for 4 years. And now what could be going through his mind? What kind of pain and joy and sorrow and he can't imagine what's bound up in this person who had done so much, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, taken these political risks, passed the 13th Amendment, and now was sitting there at the end of the war in the chair of the president, the pretender president he had vanquished. April 9th, Robert E. Lee surrenders. That's the end of the Civil War, the official end, when the head of the Army of the Confederacy surrenders formally. 2 days later, Lincoln gives his last speech, 7 days after being in Richmond. And in his last speech, he says, one of the most famous lines is, in relation to the South, remember now he's got to be president of all the people again, not just the North. He says, finding themselves safely at home, it would be utterly immaterial whether they had ever been abroad. So there's an olive branch there, right? Lincoln saying, look, it's over. We're one country again. You're safely back in the country. It does not matter that you were away. Now you're back. Let's make good, okay? But a lot of people still don't know what Lincoln's going to do, okay? They know what he's going to say. They don't know what he's going to do. April 14th, 3 days later, Lincoln goes to a play, Blow Off Steam. Play is Our American Cousin, a comedy. Ulysses S. Grant, who was the head of Union forces, sort of the equivalent of Robert E. Lee on the Confederate side, supposed to accompany him and then cancels kind of at the last minute. And as he's watching the play with his wife seated next to him, a man named John Wilkes Booth, who's an kind of an actor who lives in the shadow of his brother's shadow, who lives in the Edwin Booth is one of the most famous actors in all of the United States. John Wilkes Booth is an actor, but he's nowhere near as good as his brother. And they had radically different political views too. Edwin Booth was, pro-union, and Edwin Booth knew that his brother was having some really strange, beliefs in regards to the war. John Wilkes Booth had plotted for years to kidnap Lincoln and some of the higher members of the cabinet, take them captive. He'd hatched this plot a long time ago. Now that the war was over, he wanted that plot to continue, and he had conspirators. John Wilkes Booth walks into Ford's Theater. You can go to Ford's Theater today. You can visit it in Washington, D.C. I highly encourage it. It is an absolutely fascinating place to go to. They just remodeled it so to be a historic site. John Wilkes Booth walks up the stairs to this what do you call it? Balcony, not the balcony, one of these boxes off the stage. Takes this tiny little revolver, which you can find at the Museum of American History. Takes a revolver and points it in the back of Lincoln's head as he watches the play and fires. There's screams. Many people think it's part of the play. John Wilkes Booth jumps off of this from this box, lands on the stage, breaks his ankle, and runs off shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," as it is with tyrants, which is the state motto of Virginia, and runs off and is not captured for several days. In fact, there's a huge reward. He's finally cornered in a barn in Virginia. They burn the barn down and they shoot him, and he's killed. The soldiers that end up cornering him. In the meantime, also a number of people who are conspired to help him escape are hanged. Including women like Mary Surratt, who was an innkeeper who helped him. One can imagine the intense trauma that this would visit. I mean, if you remember, well, I'm sure many of you don't, but September 11th, 2001, or the assassination of John F. Kennedy, or there are various other events that have lesser of a sort of traumatic effect, but are nonetheless traumatic. Sort of shocking events, which just changed the world. This was something which sent many in the North into despair, because there now was no clear idea as to what exactly was going to happen. Lincoln, who had led the country through the war, many have been looking to him saying, okay, what's next, dude? Like, what are you going to do? And he was dead. And this opens up an huge can of worms. The fact that Booth has done this is now besides the point. What is true is that the country has no leader. The person who was going to guide them into some form of Reconstruction is now dead. And a bigger problem is that here's the execution of the conspirators. The bigger problem is who is now president. And people start to there starts to be all of this revisiting as to what would Lincoln do? What would Lincoln have done if he'd still been alive? And this is one of the biggest what ifs in history, but it's also something that people are struggling with in the aftermath of his death. And so they start looking at the past into the Civil War as to what was Lincoln thinking? It's a good rhyme there. What was Lincoln thinking? December 1863, there's a little bit of a clue. Congress had tried to pass something, and this is while it's starting to become clear that the Union is going to win. Congress, which remember is totally comprised of Northerners, tries to pass something called the 10% plan. The 10% plan, and now it's not, that's kind of like the nickname for it. It's called the 10% plan because it means that 10% of all of those people who could vote in 1860, right, in the South, had to pledge loyalty to the United States of America and to the Union. And if that was done, if 10%, 1 out of every 10 Confederates, remember, this does not include those who are enslaved because they could not vote and were not on the 1860 rolls at that time. The state had to also abolish slavery in their constitution. So if they could do both of these things, 10% loyalty, state abolishes slavery, maybe they could come back into the Union. Now, this plan was Lincoln's, okay? This was Lincoln's idea as to what could be done, and he sort of announces this, and if so, then the state could restart the Union. The problem that happens is that many members of his own party, of Lincoln's own party, think that this plan stinks. They think it's way too lenient. They think it's way too easy for a state to come back. It's just 10% of voters. So Republicans, of whom Lincoln is one, in Congress come up with something which ends up being called the Wade-Davis bill. So you got the 10% plan, you got the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill ups that percentage from 10% to 50%, okay, and adds some other things, right? So it's kind of taking Lincoln's original plan and then saying, well, yeah, let's make this a little harder. 50% of adult white men. So now see the difference there? Not about who's voting, just who's like, there's a lot of people went from 18 to 20 during the war, right? Who couldn't vote before and now could. Or actually, the voting age, I believe, was 21 back then. 50% of adult white men had to pledge allegiance. The new government had to be composed of totally people who did not fight in the war. Try to find people who didn't fight in the war. A lot of, I mean, remember, this is all men, so you got to find men who didn't fight in the war. There's various reasons why those people would exist. Could be very young, could be whatever. But they couldn't have fought. Anybody who was a Confederate leader, meaning like a general or a politician or a governor or something like that in the Confederacy, they can't ever serve in office again. This gets to Lincoln's desk, and Lincoln's like, dude, I mean, I don't think he said dude, but you know what I'm saying. Lincoln says, dude, this is a lot harsher, and I don't know that this is workable. And remember, one of the things that's happening is that as this comes to his desk, this is the beginning of 1864, Lincoln's going to election year. Lincoln's like, I think this is too harsh. Let's wait until the Congress meets again and let's go back over this. Okay, we can do this later. He does something called a pocket veto, where he takes the bill and leaves it on his desk, and then walks out the door. So Congress expires. That Congress expires. You have to have a new Congress that's voted in. He's like, well, let's work with this with whatever new Congress comes in 1864 during the presidency. Okay, that's what happens. So, but then between 1864 and 1865, there's no new plan. Okay, that doesn't happen. Remember the 1864 election. Lincoln is reelected. 1865, you have the 13th Amendment, and then he's killed in April 1865. So that's where people are at. They don't know what's going to happen. There is no plan on the books. There is no legislation that says what they're going to do. So I want to leave that moment because that's a really important moment, because what you have to understand is that most of the contours of what's going to be Reconstruction are not going to be really figured out until after Lincoln's death, and all of these contours are being compared to what happened before, right? So they're kind of thinking, and why that's important is, and I'll give you one big reason why it's important. This year, you may be aware of what's going on with the former president, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is being brought up on charges in relation to the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution in terms of starting an insurrection. 14th Amendment, all of those laws are passed after Lincoln's dead. Okay, so after Lincoln's death, Congress comes in and passes the 14th Amendment. He's already started the 13th Amendment, which passed when Lincoln was alive. 14th Amendment's after Lincoln's dead. And so all of this has to be done. All of this is going to be done that affects us profoundly today in this aftermath of what we call Reconstruction, which is going to be really messy and a lot of people opposed. So just remember that timeline, because that's really important. But I want to go into these, what is informing those who now see Lincoln dead and see a new president coming in, who I'll talk about in a second. And how do you solve the problem? And there's 4 basic theories that emerge in relation to what's going to happen. 4 basic theories. The first theory, and these are increasing severity, which what I mean is they go from, say, what people thought would have been Lincoln's idea, okay, which is called the presidential theory, which is based on Lincoln's kind of 10% plan from the beginning. And the theory, though, doesn't talk about specifics. The theory, this presidential theory, is basically like, look, this is what Lincoln wanted. Lincoln thought that the states had just lost their governments. So the government, and you can see how this could be logical, the governments had kind of abandoned the people of these states. And so as long as the states had new governments, which had different contours, such as banning slavery, such as, having 10%, thing like that, they're back in. That's it. The country's solved. The country's whole again. That's the presidential theory. There's something called the state suicide theory. State suicide theory says that states in leaving the country, and this is a little harsher, states in leaving the country had stopped being states. They'd done like the reverse of what states did in becoming states. They were originally territories, not in the case of the first 13, but they were originally territories out west. They had to petition with a certain number of people, and then they had to, petition for statehood. So the state suicide theory is like, okay, states are now just territories. Now they have to be like kind of be readmitted by Congress. Okay, not a bad plan. It gives another layer of approval. So the president can't just decide, hey, 10% and pass it through Congress. Now it's like, no, the states have to individually apply to be back to be states. The third, and this gets harsher, is the conquered provinces theory about what to do. States, when they left, not only lost their identity as states, they lost their identity as territories. In conquered provinces theory, and this goes back into age-old theories about warfare, a place that has been conquered, a piece of land that has been conquered, and this goes back far in human history, a place that is conquered is considered, at the mercy of the conqueror. And so one should not even assume under this theory, or at least this is what people are saying, that these are even territories. They don't even get to keep their contours as, like, Louisiana doesn't even really need to stay the shape of Louisiana, or Florida doesn't need to stay the shape of Louisiana, right? Or Florida. They revert to just land that can be mixed up and ordered in any way that the conqueror wants. So you see how harsh that is. Now that doesn't happen, because you can see that the states kind of remain the same, basically. But you'll see elements of this as we go further. You'll see elements of this creeping in, this theory. The last one is the harshest, which is not only did the states not become territories, not only does, the states lost their governments, not only do they become and none of that. These states had to gain back not only their identity as states, the people in them had to gain back their constitutional rights. Those people in those areas now that were at the mercy of the Union Army now had no rights. And that they had to gain back their constitutional rights as well as gaining back their statehood. So you can see how these get harsher and harsher. And that brings us to the president. Okay, that brings us to Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. In here, check out this little guy down here, this little poster. Let me take a drink. By the way, anybody have any questions? Just any questions about anything we've gone over so far? I know it's a small class, so but you're always free to ask questions. Just go back in time a little bit. 1864. So we're in 1865, basically. Lincoln's dead. Go back a year. Lincoln had been running for president, and Lincoln had chosen a new running mate. Lincoln had chosen a running mate in 1864 who was a slave owner. And you might be like, why the hell did Lincoln do that? Well, the reason was, and there was a logic to it, was that it looked like Lincoln thought he was going to lose, actually. He thought he was going to lose to McClellan. And in doing that, he wanted to bring together a national unity ticket. In fact, it wasn't even called like the Republican ticket. He renamed the ticket the National Union ticket. And said, well, in order to bring everybody here, I'm going to choose a slave owner who is a Democrat, so to bring the country back together, so that people, or specifically white voters, won't think that that I'm going to do anything too radical in regards to slavery. Because a lot of people were opposed to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of people were, who were still slave owners in the North. So he chooses Johnson. Remember, when you choose a vice president, you expect them to do absolutely nothing. Vice presidents have virtually no power in relation to the president, except that if the president dies, they become president. That's super powerful, but that doesn't always happen. In fact, it doesn't usually happen. Also, the vice president just does ceremonial stuff, and so Lincoln kind of said, "Look, this is a good bet. You know, I'm going to choose this guy, but he's never going to become president. I'm going to get kind of the juice from those people who would probably vote for him, or vote for, you know, or wouldn't vote for me, but might see him as." That's how vice presidents are chosen. And this backfires terribly, terribly. Johnson is not only a slave owner, he's a vicious racist. He is a white supremacist through and through, in a way that Lincoln really wasn't, right? Okay, you could call Lincoln kind of a white supremacist, but in terms of his rhetoric. But Johnson was somebody who wanted to, you know, did not want any of these reforms. Johnson has his own Reconstruction plan after Lincoln's death. Johnson says, look, I'm president. I'm gonna bring back this country together, just as Lincoln would have, or nobody knows what Lincoln really would have done. And he starts to grant amnesty to a whole series of Confederate leaders, generals, politicians. Basically, they write to him. They say, "Please forgive me. You're pardoned." And he starts to do this, and this is really starting to not only anger, it's starting to create a huge problem in Congress, because Congress is like, wait a second. Another problem is, and this is kind of a quirk of the political calendar, is that the Congress, which is again composed entirely of northern states at this time, because there has been no new election in the South to bring back, right? To bring back all these southern states. Congress has to, it won't meet until December. And you might be like, what? Yeah, this is April. Congress is not going to meet till December. The reason why is because back in the past, it took a long time for congressmen to travel to DC, so they would go home for a long period of time. So Congress would meet, and then it would not meet for a long time. And it just so happened that Lincoln is assassinated right at the really beginning of when Congress isn't meeting. Big recess, not till December. So Johnson's like, I'm doing it. And I'm just gonna, I've got to act. I'm the president. Congress isn't here. So so he's not only does he start pardoning all of these, he says basically the way that the states can come back is they just need to do a few things. One, they have to revoke secession. They have to say we're back. They can't still secede. They have to repudiate their debt. So they have to basically say any sort of money, any sort of debt that they have, the US government is not going to take that on. You got to pay that debt. So this is a way of not bringing the burden of these destroyed states into the federal government, which makes sense. The other part is the 13th Amendment. He says, look, 13th Amendment is passed. Now you got to ratify that. When you do that, you're back. You're back. You guys that left, that seceded, resulted in the death of 600,000 people. Now you're back. Enslaved millions of people. You're back. That's all it needs. That's what he says. That's his plan. And he starts to implement it. Well, the problem is the South sees this hole. Not only they see a hole in the 13th Amendment, and they see a hole in having Johnson, who's a slave owner, like many of them formerly, and say, let's get on this. They see these easy conditions. They all try to get pardoned. They all start to get pardoned by Johnson, those who write letters. And by December, now there's an election. There's elections in November. Many Confederate leaders are elected to positions of power in the South. But remember how the election works, and this is super important if you want to understand January 6th, 2021, if you want to understand the indictments of President Trump, if you want to understand anything that's going on this year, really, is that as happened on January 6th, and that was a presidential election year. 1865 is not a presidential election year, okay? But here's the thing. They have a special elections to fulfill all these seats. So there's all these people that are about to go to DC to be brought in by the next Congress. This happened in 2020. In 2020, not only was the Congress responsible for bringing in all of these new Congress people back in 2020, they're elected in November. They start to make their way towards Washington. Prior to January 6th, there's an earlier date in which the former Congress then approves the new Congress. They basically allow them in. They have to do it by a vote. So that's what happened in 2021. The old Congress votes and says, ratifies the vote of all of those that had been elected and say, okay, you guys are now part of the Congress. Now you got a new Congress. That happened before January 6, 2021. And in 1866, that happened, that was supposed to happen in early 1866, where you had all of these new Congress people brought back in. The old Congress in 1865 basically says, after all these people are elected, you guys stay home, okay? Don't come back. We're not honoring that election. We were not around to oversee that election. We don't believe in that election. Johnson does not have any power in relation to us. We're taking over this project. And so the old Congress, which is largely northern states, remember, they refuse to seat the new Congress. They refuse. They say, go back home. So all that election is kind of made null and void. Remember also, it means the only people voting are white Southerners, men. So they go, look, no, we're not doing that. The North says, don't come in. So still, the South does not have their government back because Congress has stepped in and refuses to approve that. The Southern states, in the meantime, and during this whole process, try to create a situation of slavery by using the 13th Amendment's clause regarding incarceration. And what they start to do is they start to pass a series of things called the Black Codes. Black Codes are enormously important in American history. They don't exist anymore. Why they don't exist is important. But the fact that they did exist shows you what the South was thinking. The South was thinking, look, you got your 13th Amendment, which says that, you know, as long as somebody's incarcerated, they don't have these rights of not being enslaved. So what they do is they start to arrest every single black man, especially that they see, for anything. And if that sounds familiar, that's because was born. A lot of Southern police forces are born after the 13th Amendment's passed. Okay, they're born with that idea. They're born with the idea that this racist idea of incarceration equals labor. Whether or not that's put into practice today, it just gives you a sense of where sort of racial profiling to a certain extent comes from in this country. The Bill of Rights, remember, does not apply to the states when it was first ratified, those first 10 amendments. So still you're in this zone. It's only going to be the 14th Amendment that's going to ratify them. So people have no rights. Those who are formerly enslaved still have no rights. And there's nothing to say, and you'll see what the 14th Amendment says in a second. There's nothing to say that they can have any rights. The South starts to define things. Here's some of the Black Codes and give you an idea in the language of the Black Codes why they don't exist anymore. Okay. Let's go with the Mississippi Vagrant Act, 1865. And again, excuse the language here, but this is the language as it was back in the 1860s. So all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes over the age of 18 years found with no lawful employment or business or found unlawfully assembling themselves together either in the day or nighttime shall be deemed vagrants, and on conviction thereof shall be fined and imprisoned. First of all, notice the definition of who is affected by the law. The law specifically targets people based on their complexion, based on the perceived color of their skin. It doesn't say those people who had been formerly enslaved. It just says there are essentially black people and white people, and those people who are black fall under this law, Mississippi Vagrant Act. And all of these have the same clauses in there, see? And they get copied throughout the South. So Mississippi's copying, Alabama's laws and copying Tennessee's law, right? They're all copying each other's laws using the same language, all of it directed towards groups of people who are judged to be part of a group of people based on the perception of the law in regards to their race, or genealogy or whatever, or former enslavement being part of the proof of what their color is. Okay. So you can see how shaky that is. Okay. See how kind of terrible that is, but also where the logic's going to break down. So anyway, those are the black codes. And the South passes tons of them all over the South to re-enslave. Specifically, these are not laws because these laws need to be passed. Laws about vagrancy. No, that's just an excuse. There's a horse and wagon going down the road filled with a bunch of white supremacists or former Confederates with guns. They just go start picking people up, start putting them in camps and making them work, or putting them in prison and then hiring them out. Basically just re-enslavement. These with huge kind of sentences. So you see the beginning of the South trying to bring back slavery, but not call it slavery. But they want to base it now on color. Why that's really important is because slavery as defined by the color of somebody's skin or the perception of what somebody's complexion was, that is not really how slavery was defined prior to the Civil War. All the way into 1700s, there's nothing that really says that somebody, if they are, there are laws that say this, but there's no like sort of federal definition of who somebody is that is enslaved. Originally it was people who are non-Christian. Then it was, it starts to evolve into largely African and African-American slavery because of the source of where many of these people are being abducted, right, which is Africa. And so this racism and slavery develop together and get more and more closely allied as you get to 1865 over the course of like 150 years. So when these black codes are passed, it's just basically a white supremacist series of codes, which essentially says if you are black, then you were essentially enslaved, or essentially you have these types of rights. This is what your rights are defined. The northern politicians who see what's going on with the black codes and see what's going on with Johnson say, look, we're taking over the government. I kind of explained this before. We're taking over the government. We're going to take over Reconstruction, and we're going to basically make Johnson completely irrelevant. We're more powerful than Johnson. If we don't admit the Southern congressional delegations, we still have more power than the president. So we're going to erase that election, that special election that elected all these white supremacists, that didn't allow any African Americans to vote. And we're going to get rid of these black codes. They also fund the Freedmen's Bureau to help those who are enslaved make the transition to freedom and jobs and literacy and things like that. That's one of the big goals of the Freedmen's Bureau. And they also propose something called the Civil Rights Act, a Civil Rights Act that will protect those rights of those who were formerly enslaved against the black codes. These are the three most famous, what they were called radical Republicans. They weren't radical at all. All they wanted was human dignity and equality. Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and Wendell Phillips, all from the North. At least two of them from Massachusetts. Remember, here's another important thing. These are that in 1864, again, going back in time a little bit, now we're in sort of getting into 1866 here. 1864, when General Sherman goes to Atlanta, burns it to the ground, and then marches to the sea, he's followed by a whole train of refugees, most of them formerly enslaved, and livestock. And he gets to the sea and he says, every single black family behind me, that's followed this train all the way to these refugees, from all of these burnt plantations, which I basically burned to the ground. Now they can all have 40 acres and a mule here on the seacoast of South Carolina and Georgia. all these lands that were abandoned by. So the idea is that land is going to be redistributed to those who were enslaved. This goes throughout the South. Many of those who were formerly enslaved believe that justice has finally come. They're going to have land. They're going to have power. Okay. Johnson, when he comes into power, rescinds this order from Sherman. Basically says it's null and void, forget it, and removes by gunpoint many of those people, many of those formerly enslaved who had taken over these plantations on the seacoast. So that's a great disappointment. That's why 40 Acres and a Mule is often used as a term of, it's Spike Lee's production company for one thing. It's also why it's also seen as this great kind of disappointment and cheat, really, of those who were enslaved. And that 40 Acres and a Mule, at least, should be what should be supplied for somebody who endured such pain and also endured such a legacy of slavery over many generations. This is also where the idea regarding reparations, which is certainly a major issue even today, comes from. Here is so remember the radical Republicans issue this idea for Civil Rights Act because all of these things are swirling out: land redistribution, Civil Rights Act, the Black Codes, right? And Johnson does a train tour, basically a white supremacist train tour, saying, "Oh no, we got to get rid of these guys are going to bring in, equality. These guys, you know what I mean? This is going to be a disaster for this country." And basically, it's all white supremacy. It's very vicious. Johnson uses what power he can. He vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau bill. He vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which come to his desk. Congress overrides both of these vetoes. And Congress is getting more and more bold. They're saying, look, Johnson can't even veto these things, right? We have enough power to get these things through. They got through this Civil Rights Act, which is a very important Civil Rights Act, by the way, but they know that if it's not a constitutional amendment, just like any law, it can be overturned by a future president or a future Congress. So Congress then proposes something called the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which is to this year being used as part of the prosecution of former President Donald Trump, a specific clause in the 14th Amendment, which I'll describe regarding insurrection. The 14th Amendment is the most powerful amendment in the US Constitution. It's specifically designed at the beginning as a response to Black codes, and I'll show you how and why. The two major clauses which have the most effect in the future Supreme Court and the future of the United States up until this very moment are going to be regarding the Black codes. There's another clause, Section 3, which refers to those who start an insurrection against the government, that they can no longer serve in office, that anybody who serves in an insurrection is disqualified from running for public office. That has never really been used, although it has been in the 14th Amendment since then. And I'll leave that aside, but pay very, very close attention because that has been dormant. It was meant to refer originally, when it was written, specifically to those who had fought against the United States. So like Jefferson Davis, for instance, who was president of the Confederacy, that if he had tried to run for president of the United States, that would have disqualified him. That was the thinking, right, behind it. Leave that third, Section 3, out for a second. We're going to talk about two other sections. Johnson campaigns against the 14th Amendment. Republicans say that Johnson and Democrats are traitors, but radical Republicans now are firmly in charge, and their goal is to reinvent Southern society. Okay, past this. These are Freedmen's Bureau. I'm going to get to the 14th Amendment. Section 1 is a section that you should really pay the closest attention to. And again, I don't exaggerate by saying this is probably one of the most important documents in human history. Because without it, the Bill of Rights in the United States means nothing. Without it, the Civil War was not fought for anything. And without it, you, and I mean you, whoever you are, including myself, have virtually no rights. And And you might be like, what? How can that be? Remember the Bill of Rights? Remember the right to religion? Bill of Rights never applied to the states before this amendment. It just applied to like the federal government. So individual states were forced in the South to adopt this 14th Amendment. But I'm going ahead of myself. Let's read it. 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. The intention of this section was originally to say, without saying anything about color or saying anything about enslavement, right? In that sense, it's genius. As long as somebody was born with 2 feet on U.S. soil, whether they were enslaved, whether they were whatever, whether they were a minute old, whether they were whatever, as long as they were born here, yeah, maybe like somebody who's a baby, for instance, that dies after 5 days, citizen of the United States. As long as they were born with 2 feet on U.S. soil, they are a citizen of the United States. It does not matter what their color is. It does not matter whether they were enslaved before. It does not matter where they live. It effectively destroys every, no, I'll get to the next section. The next section effectively destroys the black codes. But that defines what a citizen is. Really important. So now you have the definition of what a citizen of the United States is that had never existed before. Each state had their own definition. So now you have a definition. Doesn't say anything about color. That's a definition. 2 feet on U.S. soil. That's it. End of story. That has stood the test of time. That is true, as true today as it was when this was passed. The second clause builds on this first clause. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor to deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, there's a lot there. It seems like a lot of words, a lot of legalese, but all it says, and I'll just sum it up for you. 1, born with 2 feet on U.S. soil, you're a citizen. 2, no state can treat any 2 citizens differently. The laws apply equally to all people in the United States, and no state can ever say that 2 citizens are different based on anything else other than, can't say anything else. That's it. This is a absolutely world-changing section because it effectively destroys every single black code, okay? Every single black code that refers to people's color and treating them differently in relation to other people based on that, especially on that basis, they are all effectively 100% destroyed by the 14th Amendment. The federal government says they are all null and void, and they have no power. So all those black codes that said, hey, you're walking down the street, you are, African-American, you're a vagrant, re-enslavement, those laws are destroyed. Great. That's fantastic. But the South is not done with their shenanigans in trying to get around this now. So they got around the 13th Amendment with the black codes. 14th Amendment destroys the black codes. It's going to be Jim Crow, the Jim Crow system in the South, which is going to try to get around, and does for about 100 years, gets around the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. But the 14th Amendment doesn't go anywhere. And the 14th Amendment comes back with a vengeance in the Civil Rights era. And the 14th Amendment today is still the greatest guarantor of human rights in the United States of any other. But it would take 100 years after the South, after Reconstruction, when the South comes back and tries to get around it with a whole series of laws, which are upheld by the Supreme Court, by the way, including Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that you can have separate but equal facilities. Well, 14th Amendment comes back to overturn that in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So the 14th Amendment is hugely important to understand. in relation to the Civil War, as well as relation to your own lives, as well as in relation to this year's presidential election. Sections 2, 3, and 4 are almost never used. I don't even know if this links to anything. Let's check it out. Oh, here we go. Here's section 3, just so you can, here's amendment. Section 2, forget about that. So here's section 1, which is this born or naturalized. Section 3, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, well, Donald Trump did do that in 2016, shall have engaged, 17, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Congress has not, by a vote of 2/3, removed the disability of what happened on January 6th. The Supreme Court is about to decide, probably within the next month, about whether Donald Trump can be disqualified as a presidential candidate, specifically because of Section 3. Many people believe that the Supreme Court, has a lot of members who were put in there by Trump and things like that. That doesn't matter really, because Section 3 is pretty clear. So if a state determines that Donald Trump has committed insurrection, the state, like Colorado did, can take him off the ballot. And a lot of other states can do this too. And it's going to be very, very, very interesting what the Supreme Court does in relation to this. This is not a dead part of the 14th Amendment. It does not refer just to the Civil War. It was hatched then, but amendments have a life of their own. They're written with language like that. So these writers of this Section 3 are envisioning a future moment when there will be another insurrection against the United States, whether that's caused by Confederates or whoever. Those who engage in that insurrection, no matter who they are, cannot be officers of the United States. Supreme Court might decide that President Trump under this is not an officer, former President Trump is not an officer. There's a whole bunch of different ways to kind of weasel around this. But I'm of a firm conviction that this is so clear, and a lot of very prominent legal scholars believe this is so clear, that this could very well go in the direction of preventing Donald Trump from running for president this year. So you see how the 14th Amendment has this life of its own, huge, even though Section 1 is the most important section of any amendment ever passed in the United States. Section 3, just sitting there since 1866, suddenly becomes possibly one of the most, and this brings us to Donald Trump. And this brings us to Donald Trump also because let's look at the life of some of the 14th Amendment, okay? Let's look at the hidden life of the 14th Amendment. Remember that first part of the 14th Amendment. Let's go back. Okay. Is this in here? Yeah. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Well, I believe this was 2018, but I can't remember the exact date. Sometime during Trump's administration, he issued this tweet. It used to be called a tweet. And he issued this tweet, and he refers to this as birthright citizenship, which is that clause in the 14th Amendment, which is pretty clear. You're born with 2 feet on U.S. soil, you're a citizen. End of story. You want to change it? Change the Constitution. But Trump had been convinced by a couple scholars who believed that this did not apply to those who were coming across the border, the U.S. border without papers, right? Donald Trump would say illegally, believed that it did not apply to them, that birthright citizenship didn't. So he issued this tweet, which was indicative of other things that he said. He said, which costs our country billions of dollars and is very unfair to our citizens, will be ended one way or the other. It is not covered by the 14th Amendment because the word subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Many legal scholars agree. Subject to the, All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Well, okay, that's an argument. The reason why this is such an important clause in the 14th Amendment is because of what happened in 1857. Only, let's rewind, 9 years prior to the drafting of the 14th Amendment. Was a Supreme Court case called Dred Scott versus Sanford, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. In that case, Dred Scott, who was somebody who was enslaved, was brought to Minnesota, which was a free state, in the 1850s by the person who claimed that they were the owner of Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was like, "Hi, free state, later, I'm out," said, "I'm free." The slave owner, Sanford, tried to get back Scott, and Scott sued. Scott said, "Hey, I've got legal standing here. I'm free. I'm a free man. I'm going to sue." This goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It says, "No, you can't take me back. You took me to a free state. You know, I got feet on free state soil. I am free. You don't have any power over me." This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, vicious racist, whose statue was just taken down in Baltimore, by the way, a few years ago. He was in Maryland, from Maryland, issues this decision, which, and he doesn't only issue, the whole Supreme Court votes on it. Majority votes with Taney, Roger Taney, says that, first of all, slaves are property. That's what he says. First of all, slaves are property. So it doesn't matter where you take your property. You take your property from a slave state to a free state, you don't automatically become free. It is true that there was nothing that said that Scott would immediately become free upon entering a free state. But the fact is, that's kind of the assumption that a lot of free states were operating under, because you had the Underground Railroad, you had many people who were enslaved that were escaping to the north, and they considered themselves free once they were there. And they were protected by the laws of many of these states who had passed laws in relation to, hey, we're free, we don't respect slavery, so you're going to be free. But Taney went further. Taney also went and tied slavery to color by saying that African Americans, by their appearance, cannot even be citizens. Cannot be not, this is wrong here. Cannot even be citizens of the United States. And that doesn't matter whether they're free in a free state, that doesn't matter whether they're enslaved in a slave state, doesn't matter whether they're free in a slave state, does not matter. Solely basis on their color, they cannot be citizens of the United States. The prohibition against slavery in any state, according to Taney and according to his Supreme Court in 1857, is unconstitutional in and of itself. This decision sends Frederick Douglass into despair. This decision seems to be creating a sort of wholly white supremacist country in which everybody is being judged by their complexion, and that in this environment, in this terrible environment, that slavery will now be in everywhere which was formerly free. So that includes New York, that includes New York City, that includes Maine, that includes Minnesota. It does not matter. You're in the United States and you're a slave owner in the South and you want to bring your slaves anywhere you want, go right ahead. Go right ahead. That's what the decision was in 1857. That's one of the reasons why the 14th Amendment came about and said, just to repeat, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Dred Scott immediately as a result of this becomes a citizen. I actually do not know, and I should know this, whether Dred Scott outlived the Civil War. I don't know. But he would have been a citizen as a result of the 14th Amendment as of 1866. This question of birthright citizenship, as Donald Trump called it, comes up before the Supreme Court in 1898. So this is another generation on, 30 years on. Wong Kim Ark, young man born in the United States to Chinese parents who then returned to China. He then comes back. So he comes back without his parents. And he says, look, I've got the papers here. I was born here. believe he was born in San Francisco, but don't quote me on that. I was born here. I'm a citizen of the United States. I have all the rights of every other citizen of the United States, according to the 14th Amendment. This is denied. The United States actually denies this. The United States has a case. United States versus Wong Kim Ark. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Is Wong Kim Ark a citizen of the United States? U.S. is arguing, no, this only applied to former enslaved persons. This doesn't apply to Wong Kim Ark. The amendment, in clear words and in manifest intent, includes the children born within the territory of the United States of all other persons of whatever race or color domiciled within the United States. Every citizen or a subject of another country, while domiciled here, is within the allegiance and the protection and consequently subject to the jurisdiction, exactly what Donald Trump says does not apply, of the United States. His allegiance to the United States is direct and immediate, and although about local and temporary, continuing only so long as he remains within our territory, is yet, quote, strong enough to make a natural subject, for if he hath issue here, that issue is a natural born subject. And his child, as said by Mr. Binney in his essay before quoted, if born in the country, is as much a citizen as the natural born child of a citizen, and by operation of the same principle. This Supreme Court case determined that every single person who is born on U.S. soil, no matter how, whether they are born to non-citizens, whether they are born, whatever, however, 2 feet on U.S. soil, you're a citizen. End of story. The attacks on what Donald Trump called birthright citizenship back in 2018 or whatever year he issued that tweet are immaterial. This is established U.S. Supreme Court case law. You have to change the Constitution, or you have to get a Supreme Court that decides that this was wrongly decided, neither of which are going to happen anytime soon. Very, very, very important Supreme Court case based on one of the most ironclad and important amendments in the U.S. Constitution. So just keep that in mind when we talk about the 14th Amendment, how far-reaching the 14th Amendment is. Wow, I'm going I'm going to finish this today. Going along a lot about the 14th Amendment. We'll discuss more about the end of the Civil War next time, but let me finish this. Let me get to the 15th Amendment and then we'll stop. And anything that I don't cover, by the way, I'm going to have videos that kind of fill in the gaps. So the end of Reconstruction will be covered in a video that you'll be able to check out. But I'll do an abbreviated version of it at the beginning of next week's class. Well, what happens is that, so now you have the 14th Amendment, now you have the 13th Amendment. There's talk about full suffrage for all African Americans in the country as well as in the South. Remember, the North has laws against African Americans being able to vote. Voting is not covered in the U.S. Constitution, by the way, anywhere, or at least up until the 15th Amendment. It's just not covered. It's left up to the states. So the states can decide who they want to, right? They can just, right? So that's still an open question. Johnson's Reconstruction Plan is gone. They issued something called the Reconstruction Act of 1867. The South is put under full military rule. The Union Army occupies and controls the South after the Civil War. States have to grant the right to vote to freedmen. So every single person who was formerly enslaved now must have the right to vote. States must approve new state constitutions, which ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments. And if they do that, then they can come back and be states. Well, a lot of these states end up doing that. And you can see the 2 dates here, the state where they're readmitted to the Union and the date where the date where Confederate sympathetic leaders take over the state. So there's going to be 2 things that go on. One is the state time where they're readmitted, and then the time between that readmission and then the creation of governments which are Democrat, but are also, more tellingly, composed largely of people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. So those are the 2 dates there. And that's going to be the start of Jim Crow, essentially, in the South, into these different states. This date in, the date in red. Important, but it shows you military occupation in the South. Johnson is impeached by the House of Representatives. He's just about to leave office, by the way. This is 1868, but they want to get rid of him anyway. I won't go through the impeachment, which is kind of in the weeds and important. It's the first impeachment in U.S. history. Johnson is impeached by the House of Representatives, which is then referred to the Senate, and the Senate fails to remove him. I should not say impeach here. I should say fails to remove him by one vote. So he stays on as president until the end of his term, and then Ulysses S. Grant is going to be elected president in 1868. So it's immaterial that he is not removed, but Congress still wants him out. They want to get rid of him. They say he's violating certain laws, and I won't go into that, but that's the first impeachment in U.S. history. There'll be 3 more to come, 2 of them for Trump and 1 for Clinton. Nixon is not impeached. He resigns before he can be impeached and removed. None of the 4 impeachments result in the removal of the president. Okay. That's impeachment and removal are 2 separate processes. House does the impeachment, Senate has to remove. Senate has never removed a president. 15th Amendment. So here's your last amendment. This is where I'll end. 1869. So 3 years after, so now 4 years after the Civil War, the end of the Civil War. Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Does not say sex, so does not give women do not have the right to vote as of the 15th Amendment. That will take the 19th Amendment another 50 years later, which will complete that process of allowing those who are women to vote. This is, hello? Is there a question? I'm sorry. Sorry, somebody's got their mic on, I think. Here's the 15th Amendment. This would be the omission of sex is one of the categories by which one could not deny people the right to vote. Becomes a huge issue which splits the women's suffrage movement all the way into the late 19th century. Here's the 15th Amendment, and so the 15th Amendment is supposed to bring the right to vote to those who are African American in the South. As we all know, that is not going to come into place until the Civil Rights era, when you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is going to finally do away with Jim Crow laws regarding voting. Voting is still one of the most contentious issues in the United States. There is nothing in the Constitution that specifically says about voting aside from the 15th Amendment. Congress did not pass an amendment in relation to strengthening that. 15th Amendment and 19th Amendment are the only 2 amendments that there's another amendment that says that people who are 18 can vote. That happens in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, I think early 1970s. So there are a couple amendments, but nothing that sort of states can still pull shenanigans in relation to how they offer people the right to vote, although they can't deny the right to vote based on race, color, previous condition of servitude, sex, or anybody under the age of over the age of 18. So what we'll talk about next time, because I've run up against time here, is the emergence of I'll do this real quick because I got 2 minutes. We'll say 1:45. Southern blacks are in power during Reconstruction, during this period of time, 1865 to 1877. Many of them run for office. Many of them get elected. Many of them from various walks of life, from the ministry. You have 2 senators, 2 African-American senators. First 2 African-American senators go to Washington, Senator Hiram Revels and Senator Blanche Bruce. They're mayors, they're governors, they're Congress people. They're all over the place in Southern life during Reconstruction. And this is also resented immensely by Southern whites, specifically ex-Confederates, who start to work to take over many of these governments, terrorize African Americans from running for office, and legally, through language that does not specifically target people based on race, but legally find a way to completely disenfranchise African Americans in the South and make them essentially put them into a condition that is as close to a previous condition of servitude, previous condition of slavery as possible, to take away and strip away all their rights that were granted, that were written into the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, written into the Constitution with the 15th Amendment, written into the Constitution with the 13th Amendment, All of those are what many Southern former Confederate leaders, when they come back into power after the end of Reconstruction, are trying to do. By the 1880s, there is no more African American class of power in the South, because of, again, not only a series of laws of Jim Crow laws, which we'll talk about next time, but also because of a series of because of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the rise of a terrorist army formed of former Confederates, which starts to control the South and starts to kill and or terrorize and or use as an example African Americans that would speak up for their rights in the South and terrorizes their families. That is the beginning of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is not just a series of laws. Jim Crow is a terrorist system in the South. The South becomes essentially a police state all the way into the 1960s, where you cannot take any election that takes place with the help of the South. Even elections of people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to a certain extent, have to be questioned because of that. The South has more or less power in certain elections, but that has to be taken into account when we talk about the history of the United States going forward in this class in relation to Jim Crow, because you have a huge group of people who are completely disenfranchised unconstitutionally during that period of time. So, anyway, that's it. I've talked a long time. Thank you for listening to me. Remember, you're always free to ask questions. I won't always lecture like that, but Reconstruction is a particularly important lesson. There's more to tell about Reconstruction, certainly. We'll talk about what we'll begin with next time. We'll begin with the destruction of Reconstruction. We'll begin with the election of 1876, which has enormous implications for the election of 2020. And our understanding of what January 6th was in relation to what happened in 1876. We'll talk about that connection. And we'll also talk about how the United States makes this transition from a country that is coming out of war to become not only one of the biggest industrial powerhouses and economic financial powerhouses on the face of the planet, but also spreads to the West and creates a country which goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and quickly, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, is becoming a superpower and becoming clearly to the rest of the world, the world's most dominant and powerful economic, military, and cultural force. So we will cover all that after we finish the Reconstruction lesson next time, and we will also look at the West and the Gilded Age. So thank you very much, everybody. I stay on until everybody leaves, so if you have any other questions that you want to ask me, but you're all free to go. Thanks a lot. I will see everybody next week, same time, same channel, and thank you very much.
The only thing we got to do is the second quiz, right?
All you got to do is the second quiz. That's it. Or second and third. I think there might be 2 quizzes next week.
No
This
problem.
is 2 chapters. So every time there's 2 chapters, there's 2 quizzes.
When will it open up?
What, oh, are they not open?
I didn't see them when I looked.
Oh, okay. Let me. I'll go in and open them right after I get off the call. So maybe there's some glitch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna
Thank you
try
very
to
much.
take.
Yes.
I'm gonna try to take this pop-up blocker off my computer. I'm trying to take.
Yeah.
this.
Usually in the upper right, there's like a little, like with the settings, you can usually erase that. I can find the quiz and the videos of the lectures on Blackboard. Right. Yes, that's correct, Joel. In each of the folders.
I know
Sorry.
if I have any issues, I'll email you again.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
When I looked into your question, I saw that it worked, so I was like, I'm not sure. So
Yeah, it worked like hours later.
okay, I don't think that was anything I did, but
No,
great.
it wasn't you. It's just this
It
computer.
just says pop-up blocker. Yeah. What hold on one second.
It's
What
a Mac.